Thanks for coming. I think we have some good information to share. Thanks for those of you joining us online. Hopefully we'll have a productive few hours here to share information that we're learning and new things that we're doing in our operation and what we've learned over the past year, and things for you to think about going forward. Seth, can you advance? Stop. Okay, there we go. All right. So first of all, got to start with the family here. This is what keeps me ticking. The kids are growing up, but we have my wife and I are blessed with 8 children. She's in the back, so it's a busy house, but it's a blessing. So that's what gets me up in the morning every day. My brother Ted, his wife Miranda. Ted and I own Nutradrip Irrigation, so it's a family owned and operated business. This is not advancing again. Okay, a little bit about where we're at in our operation. We're located in Northeast Kansas. For those of you that are here, you know that. We're right just 4 miles from Nebraska. We farm in Southeast Nebraska and Northeast Kansas here. We have about 800 acres of irrigation. About 250 of that is subsurface drip. So we have pivots and drip on our operation and have some experience with both. I got a photo notification this past week. It said 10 years ago today, we were plowing in our very first drip irrigation field. So we've been in this for 10 years. We've learned a lot, but we'll kind of get into a little bit of our story, how we got involved in this, and the things that we've learned. I wonder if I need new batteries. A little bit about our team. We'll do some introductions here. I'll maybe just kind of go around the room for those that are here. So we have Seth does all of our estimating. Joel recently took our service manager position. So for those of you that have systems, Joel is scheduling all of the service work. So any phone calls or issues that need to get worked on, those will be going through Joel. David Sloan will be presenting right around lunchtime. He's with Grow Guru on soil moisture probes. Trent Strom in the back takes care of sales, kind of in Kansas, eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, up into a little bit of South Dakota. Kylan Hunt is with Grow Guru as well and is also working with us on business development. My brother Ted is in the back there. Tim Wolf with Netafim will be talking a little bit later as well. My wife's in the back. Kylan's wife is in the back. Jason Scheibel with Netafim is our DRM, so takes care of all of our dealer relation work. Cortland Beyer will be talking as well. He takes care of our water quality, and he'll be highlighting some of the water quality work that we're doing. And then we've got a whole host of people out in the field. We actually have 4 crews installing this week. We've got 1 in Kentucky, 2 in Indiana, and then we've got a service crew in Missouri. So we're plowing tape. We've had a good week this week so far, but just kind of run through a few. We've got Wyatt Byers in Rock Rapids, Iowa. Trevor is in Hastings, Nebraska. Travis will be here a little bit later. He's down in Joplin, Missouri. Chris is in St. Louis, Missouri. And Taylor is in Morris, Minnesota. And then all of our sales are install and service guys. Most of them are based out of here in Hiawatha, and then we send them out wherever we need crews at. And we've actually added 6 more guys since this picture was taken. So our team is growing, our business is growing. It's been a good couple years on the sales and install and the things that we're learning. We're continuing to grow. On the support side, John Maxwell, he's not here with us today, but he does all of our drip design work. So all of our designs are subcontracted to John. So that's kind of a third party that does the actual engineering and all the hydraulics. And then, of course, the Netafim team, and there'll be some more Netafim guys joining us here after a while that just flew in overnight, or they were in California last night and will be coming here to give us a little global perspective, a couple guys from Israel. Netafim is the manufacturer that we represent. So all of our products that we install are Netafim products. They're the only drip manufacturer with agronomy support or really any kind of support in the Corn Belt. They've done a really good job of supporting us. They're continuing to innovate and to bring new products to the market. And so we exclusively use Netafim product. A little bit about our backstory. So I mentioned that 10 years ago, we put our first field in, and this is that first field. It's just 2 miles north of here. It's a 44 acres that we put in. It had a center pivot, or still has a center pivot over here on this side. We had a water supply already developed, and we were looking for a way to cover more acres with water we already had. And so for us, it was about going to an odd-shaped field. And when we installed that first system, it was kind of an aha moment for me, because when I was in high school, Dad had built greenhouses and we grew hydroponic tomatoes. And so if you're familiar with that process, hydroponics get all of their nutrients through the water. And so now this was an avenue to deliver water and nutrients to a whole field the way that we were doing it in the greenhouse. In the greenhouse, we would take tissue samples every week, and we could adjust the texture and the flavor and the color of those tomatoes based on what we were putting in through the water. So now we have that level of control with a drip irrigation field. And we were doing, and we still do, fertigation through a pivot, but a pivot you're going around every 4 or 5 days, and a lot of nutrients don't move through the soil. Nitrogen and sulfur certainly do, but when you start talking about phosphorus and potassium and a lot of the micronutrients, they don't move through the soil as well. So when we first started doing drip, it was a look at not just water, but how do we optimally deliver water and nutrients. And so most of the rest of the talk here, we're going to focus on the nutrient side of things. I've just got a couple slides here on why growers are choosing drip irrigation. And a lot of people come to us and they've got limited water, they've got an odd shaped field, and certainly those are things to think about. This is a project we did in north central Iowa this past year. This is 1.5 miles from end to end. This is a 670 acre field. He looked at putting center pivots on it. They actually had a second layout where they put a bunch of real small ones on there, and they were still only covering about 65% of the acres. So with a drip irrigation system, we put in 600 acres last year. We'll add the last 100 acres this spring because they had some drainage work to do. But we'll be covering every acre on that farm. Out of one well, there's a well that sits right here, and they're also pulling out of the Des Moines River. So we have 2 water supplies that feed on one system. So drip is a scalable system. It can scale up and down to the shape and size of the field. This is another project that Travis has going on down in Missouri. Again, this is 500 acres spread out over 2 miles coming out of a single well. So the farmer splits the crop up. He's planting corn at different stages. He's adding some wheat into the mix so he can spread that water out. At the same time, we do a lot of 40 and 50 acre fields. So drip is scalable to fit whatever shape and size of field you might have. There's no moving parts in the field. Everything's hydraulic, 12 volt DC solenoids out in the field, so we don't have any high voltage out in the field. It's a simple system, and I think that's important when we look at the longevity, which we'll talk about today. How do we get these drip systems to last a long time? That's an important part of the equation. This is just a quick animation of where we work at, so the first. We're up to 2016 there. You can kind of see where the pins have been dropped, and this is a animation here. 2015, 16, 17. So we're starting to do some projects out in Indiana, farther south, 19, down into Oklahoma a little bit, and then we really start adding a lot of projects up here in Minnesota and eastern South Dakota, and now we've expanded a lot into Nebraska. So that's kind of where we work at. You can see a lot of concentration up and down the I-29 corridor has kind of been our focus. So water, we'll kind of get into the agronomy and the water side of things. Water is only going to get you so far. And I think that's the first message that I want to focus on is when you look at what's limiting yield in your operation, water is the first thing that has to be addressed, right? That's limiting in almost every geography we work in. Sometimes it's too much, a lot of times it's not enough, but water is going to be limiting at some point. So we address water, and water in and of itself stabilizes yield. It's an insurance tool. But then what becomes the next most limiting factor? And that's going to be some kind of nutrition or biology that's going to become limiting next. And so when we started this journey, I'll call it, we were really focused on how do we identify what those limiting factors are. So I'm kind of going to walk through what we've learned in the process we've gone through to get to where we are today, and then share what we're learning today. So this is a common uptake chart that we've shared many times, but it just gives us a good visual to what does the corn plant need for nitrogen. This particular one is for nitrogen at 230 bushel. And a little bit later, I'm going to show you an uptake chart for 400 bushel. But just think about the fact of how much nitrogen do we need over this period going from V9 to R1. 7 days of nitrogen per day for 21 days. So we've got an incredible amount of uptake that happens in a really short window. And how do we deliver that? And when we look at our operation, right now, we're fall applying on anhydrous, and then we expect that nitrogen to be available when the plant needs it. And the things that we've learned over the past year are really starting to challenge this method. And I want to highlight some of those things as we go through this presentation. So if we could spoon feed, which this is why things like Y-drop and side dress and all the in-season applications, this is why they work, is because we're spoon feeding all of those little steps along the way. And how many steps should we break that into, and what is the right balance? And so we really focused on how do we understand that uptake of timing. And so one of the tools we started with was a tool Netafim developed that helped us visualize what those numbers are. So this was a tool we used that we put in the day length of the hybrid, what our yield goal was, the nutrients that were in the soil to start with, and then what we were applying with the planter. And then this is kind of like a checkbook register that basically says, well, if this is what I started with, when am I going to start to run out? And so it takes GDUs of weather and inputs those based on your growing season, and it shows us when we need to start applying nitrogen, for example. And you can do that for every nutrient in the profile. The next step, though, is how do I know whether those nutrients are getting into the plant? How do I know that just because I'm applying phosphorus or potassium, how do I measure to verify that I'm getting the correct levels? And so that was kind of the second step to this process, was tissue sampling. And we've been tissue sampling here on our farm for probably 15 years or more. And tissue samples are, I'll say they're not an exact number, but they tell us if we're in the right range. They tell us if we're on the road. Are we on the road, or are we in the right ditch or the left ditch? And so we feel like tissue sampling is as good of a tool as we have today to measure where we are. There are other tools we're looking at. We're looking at sap sampling. I've got some sap testing equipment in the back there that we can go over with you, and I'll show how we're using that. But really, tissue sampling is where we have the most confidence because of the amount of data that we have and how to use that data. So our first step with tissue sampling was graphing and understanding what those tissue samples were doing over time. So you can see we've got time frames or growth stages, and then we're looking at where our nitrogen values are. And one of the first challenges we ran into was how do you know what those values should be? And I want to show you some of the things that we've learned there, but I want to especially highlight nitrogen and sulfur because those are highly leachable nutrients, and they're two nutrients that we feel like we haven't done a real good job with as we go back and we look at what we've learned, especially here over the last year. So this is a nitrogen one here. Let me get that to. And this is two different growers and some university values that we threw together. So the first one here is nitrogen. This green line at the top is a high yield grower that we've been working with. The red line is a low yield grower. So just to kind of give you a reference point, this top grower, he was raising and is raising in the 350 to 380 bushel yield category out in Illinois. This red line here is a producer in eastern Kansas, probably more in that 280 to 300. And so you can see on nitrogen, there's a large spread between a guy that's high and one that's low. And then we have some university recommendations. This blue line is a South Dakota State recommendation that kind of sets that yield trajectory maybe a little lower than it should be. So you can see that there's a large spread, again, between different management practices. Potassium, kind of the same story. Those are those same two growers. Get that green one to show up there. There we go. So you can see potassium values here on a high yield grower starting at 3.5, dropping off to 2.5, whereas a lower yielding grower, they start at 2, drop all the way down to 1.5, and then come back up a little bit at the end. So I just want to make the point that nutrient values in the tissue, they matter, okay? And if you don't know where your numbers are, how do you know how to address your crop this coming year or the next year? And how do we address those numbers going forward? And so the things that we've learned on tissue sampling is helping us to make decisions, maybe not for that exact week or that exact next management decision, but it helps us with our trajectory for next year. Now, one of the challenges that we ran into when we just focused on tissue sampling is growers would apply potassium or they would apply phosphorus and we wouldn't see this number move. And we were trying to understand, well, why would we not get a response when we apply some kind of nutrient? And so what we've moved to now is more of an approach where we're looking at soil and tissue sampling together. And so I'll get into that here in a little bit, but just to highlight some of the successes that we've had when we look at water and nutrients together. So in 2017, we met with Sonny Beck out in Indiana, and he said, one of my goals is I want to raise 400 bushel corn before I die. And so we put a drip irrigation system in, and we have 3 years of their nutrient management and what they did to go from 300 bushel dry land to 400 bushel irrigated. So you can see when they added water and nutrient management, they had a weather event there in 2019, but they've got a consistent yield up around 380 to 400 bushel. And as I look at this and I think, why can't we do that on every acre? Why isn't that possible? And we've got 4 or 5 growers that we're working with that are consistently over 350 bushel on a field average. So I want to challenge some of our thinking. Sometimes we're satisfied, or we seem to be satisfied with this 300 bushel level, but I think there's so much more potential to optimize the nutrients that are in the soil, the sunlight that we're given. If we have water available, we should be somewhere in this ballpark. So those are the goals that we're shooting for. Whoa, let's go way back. Some of the goals that we're shooting for and then the things that we're working towards. Yep, keep going. Okay, right there. Another site that we've been privileged to work with is the PTI farm out in Pontiac, Illinois. 2019, they were raising dryland corn in that 270 to 280 bushel range. And put a drip irrigation system in the first year, or the first 2 years, it was a surface drip irrigation system, and now we've actually gone out and buried some of that in, and you can see we're in that 370, 360, 398 this year. So again, when we put high management with water, there is a lot of potential that we're leaving on the table, I feel like, and so we're going to talk about what some of those practices are and what we've learned by watching some of these high yield producers. The BEX program that they're doing, we did an in-depth analysis of the cost of their program. Like looked at what did it cost them to raise 400 bushel corn. They they netted somewhere around $500 to $700 an acre. In other words, it paid really, really good. Sometimes we think, well, we're just going to throw the kitchen sink at it and this isn't profitable, but really when it's done correctly, there's a lot of profit potential in a high yield practice. So 2 years ago, we were introduced to the Next Level Ag Group out of South Dakota. And just to kind of give you a brief rundown, this is their soil sampling program. And what you see on the left side of the screen is a standard soil sample. Okay, it's going to show your standard nitrate, organic matter, calcium, all the standard extractions that you would be used to looking at on any other soil test. Over here in the green box is more of a plant available or soil health scores. So if you're familiar with the H3A extraction or the soil health, that's what we're looking at over here. And some of the things that we've started to learn is just because we have potassium in the soil and it's showing up over here on the standard test, that doesn't mean the plants can get a hold of it. And so potassium, calcium in particular are two nutrients that a lot of times are not plant available. And I'll kind of highlight some of the things that we've learned with that. A couple other numbers on here that are really important that we're starting to look at a lot more intensely is this HT3 CO2 score. So basically, CO2 is emitted from your soil by the biology. And so if you measure the CO2 in the soil or coming off the soil, they actually take your soil sample, put it in a little chamber, and then measure that CO2 coming off of there, I think for 48 hours. And that gives them a score, it gives you a score for how biologically active your soil is. It's like how fast the engine is running in your soil. If you have dead soil and a low score, that soil it's not working for you. And so this is a really important number to understand how we can change that. There's a lot of biological companies out there now that you can buy biology in a jug or on a seed treatment, and the goal is to get that number higher. It's to get the biology cranking in your soil faster and faster and faster. And so we're spending a lot or putting a lot more interest in what this biological number is and how much respiration. And we're also going to be looking at some sensors this year that will lay on the soil that you would leave in the field, and it will monitor your CO2 respiration 24 hours a day. There's a company that has those available now. And so we're real interested to have some of that data. One of the agronomists we work with in Idaho used them last year, and they were able to detect and verify CO2 response out of the soil based on products they were applying, either foliar or with irrigation. Some products slowed the respiration down, some products sped the respiration up. But that's a really important number to pay attention to, is what is that soil respiration and how can we impact that? Another one that we're paying a lot of attention to is this carbon to nitrogen ratio. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Water extractable organic carbon, which is we always, the number we've used in the past is organic matter. And organic matter is an important measurement, but it's not what's plant available. Water extractable organic carbon is the carbon that is very readily available to your plant. And so it's one that means a lot more for growing a crop. So one of the places that we've used this test, and Cortland's going to talk about this a little bit more as well, but this is that same field I showed you earlier where we put the drip system in. We have the center pivot over here on this side. And in 2020, we had a yield map here where we had higher yielding corn on the corner than we did underneath the pivot. And so and I'm not trying to bash pivots here, but this started to raise questions like, why would this happen? And so we went and we soil sampled underneath the pivot, and we soil sampled out here in the corner. And one of the things that we learned by looking at soil health and using this type of a test is the calcium number that we would normally look at is the same, or pretty much the same, inside and outside the pivot. Okay, 2900, 2997, those are statistically the same. However, when we look at plant available calcium underneath the pivot, we were at 337, whereas outside the pivot we were at 433. That's like a 40% or 30% difference between those two plant available calcium numbers. And so we're going to talk about this more later, but bicarbonates in water tie up calcium. It's the first thing they tie up. And so irrigation water essentially has neutralized the calcium in the soil and made it unavailable to the plant. Okay, so these are things that we're starting to look at and try to understand why things are responding or not responding the way that they are. And water quality has a huge impact on nutrient availability, which is why we're going to spend so much time on it today. One of the other things that we did was we went out and we looked at what's our soil pH and the stratification in the soil. And we looked at, so here we have at an inch and a half deep, we're at 6.2. We get all the way down to 8 inches and we're at 4.6. And think about how we soil sample today and make all of our pH recommendations. We go out and we take a 6-inch core or an 8-inch core and we average those together, right? But I think we need to start thinking about how do we impact that soil pH at a deeper level, and how can we change those pH values? And the reason that that's important is because look at what the nutrient availability does between 4.5 and 6. We lose availability of potassium, we lose availability of nitrogen and sulfur and calcium as that pH drops. And so we need to think about where those roots are growing at and how can we change that pH stratification in the soil. We strip till on our farm. We do lime applications. 2.5 acre grids would be our standard practice. We've done some 1 acre grids now, but we're really curious how we can change that number down deeper. So that's something we're starting to look at. Oh, the next one. There we go. So one thing that I want to point out that I think is having an impact on this, and why we're going to spend some time talking about bicarbonates, and Cortland's going to do a demonstration to get into this a little bit deeper. But if you look at this is a chart of the pH of rainfall. 1995, the pH of rainfall was running around 3.8 to 4. Okay, so acid rain, I remember in school growing up hearing about acid rain and what a big problem it was. And so you can, and this right here is the SO2 level in the rainwater as well. So you can see as we cleaned up fuel, as we cleaned up the power plants, the sulfur in the air came down and the pH of the rainwater is now at 6. One of the ways, or the way, that you address bicarbonates is to lower pH with water. And an acid water solution will neutralize and get rid of bicarbonates. So in the past, we had a situation where every time it rained, that bicarbonate issue was getting treated, especially on center pivot irrigated fields, where now we're not getting that same effect anymore. And we're not getting the sulfur from the rainwater. And so I think especially as we look at high pH soils, guys that irrigate a lot, we typically only irrigate 4 to 6 inches a year here, but as you move farther west and guys are putting out 8, 10, 12 inches a year or more, this is a really big deal because that bicarbonate accumulates over time. It's like glue in the soil and it builds up and it builds up. But I just kind of want to throw that out there because I think it's something that we don't spend enough time looking at is what is the environment conditions around us? How have they changed? And what is that change doing and impacting our growing conditions? If you don't have this app, I would highly encourage you to get out your phone and download this app. This is Agronomy 365 is kind of a side company to Next Level Ag, and they have an agronomy chat board where you can go ask questions to agronomists, put your soil samples on there, your tissue samples. Hey, I'm thinking about this. It's a really open forum to have an agronomy discussion. It's been a great tool for us. I've learned a lot just listening and participating in that. A lot of good information is shared from all around the country using this app. So I would highly encourage you to participate and to get on that. This is just a screenshot of what their chat board looks like. You know, guys taking pictures of the field, talking about what they're seeing in the field and different management practices. Just a lot of good information that's shared there. Okay, so to kind of take it the next step when we talk about nutrient availability and tying tissue and soil together. So Next Level Ag in their Agronomy 365 dashboard essentially ties together what we're seeing in a tissue sample with what we see in a soil sample. So their protocol is 3 times a year, we're going to take a soil sample, and then during the season, we're going to go back and we're going to take a tissue sample from that spot at least 5 times a year. We encourage you to do it every week. That data goes into the dashboard, and now we can overlay soil and tissue together. And I didn't get a screenshot of that particular thing, but you can see right here we've got a soil and a tissue score for nitrogen, for example. And so this is saying that the soil has plenty of nitrogen in it, the tissue maybe not so much. And so why would nitrogen not be getting out of the soil and into the tissue the way that we want it to? So this dashboard does a really nice job of helping you visualize what is that most limiting nutrient in your operation. We had showed earlier the graph with the values of the nutrients changing over time. What this tool has done, though, is they've taken it kind of to the next step, and they've looked at what's the relationship from nutrient to nutrient. I'm going to jump to the next slide here. Whoops, good. Because nutrients have an interaction with each other. Let's have that one out of place. We'll get to it in a little bit, but basically we need to be thinking about the nutrient balance. So if we look at this chart here, I'm having issues with my clicker. Okay, if we look at this chart here, we have a nitrogen to potassium ratio, and we're strong on nitrogen. We have a nitrogen to sulfur, and we're out of balance with too much nitrogen. And so starting to understand that if you're going to apply a nutrient or a blend of nutrients, how do you identify which one is the most limiting? And soil is dynamic. It changes every day. It changes every hour. We've gone out and tested in the morning, and then we go out and we test in the afternoon with these sap samples, and those values can change incredibly based on how much sunlight we've gotten that day, what the temperature is. So in other words, these numbers change all the time. But it's important to understand what our balance is. And so what they've done for us here is they've given us what's called a DRIS level, which is the relationship from nutrient to nutrient. And the nutrient that has the largest negative would, in theory, be your most limiting nutrient. And what we're shooting for here, there's an NBI here that's called Nutrient Balance Index. In other words, what is the balance across all of my nutrients? The goal would be to get this to 0. This one is at 2,700. It's very far out of balance. This is probably an early season sample because it has an iron level that's really high. And so if the tissue sample didn't get properly washed off, we'll get iron splashing up off the soil. So probably something going on with that iron. And we have a magnesium number here that doesn't look right either. So this one is very far out of balance. But I think this type of measurement is helping us to understand which nutrient is the most limiting. In addition to that, they have a charting tool that charts your tissue sample compared to a higher yield trajectory. And I was going back through and I reviewed, I don't know, probably a dozen of our growers this past year using this tool. And I'm just going to kind of give you a quick rundown. There was 2 nutrients that every grower was substantially lower on than they should have been, and it was sulfur and calcium. Those 2, we're a step below where we should be. Nitrogen, most guys are fine on nitrogen. Most guys are fine on phosphorus and potassium. At least at some potassium shows up in soybeans maybe a little bit more. But sulfur and calcium are substantially lower than they should be on most of our growers. So I think those are two that we need to address this year, especially with our in-season fertility, and how do we get those sulfur numbers up? Again, going back and thinking about what else does sulfur do and how did we used to get sulfur? Every year we get less and less sulfur from our rainfall. And so I think we need to be addressing our sulfur needs more and more in season. Soil health is more than nutrition. 3.6% of total yield is NP and K. 96.6% is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We went back and figured up how much we spent. I think on our operation last year, we spent somewhere, it was over $500 an acre on this 3.6%. How much attention are we paying to this 96.6%? In the past, we thought we couldn't do that much about it maybe, and so we didn't really pay attention to it. But this, especially carbon and oxygen, I think are two things that we have to start paying more attention to. But just having an understanding that we focus so much on those three things, or even all the micronutrients. But what about this really big pool that makes up a lot of our plant? Soil structure trumps nutrition 9 times out of 10. Meaning, how well drained is your soil? What's the soil flocculation look like? That soil structure is going to impact root development. It's going to impact oxygen in the soil. So how do we measure that? In going back to that soil health score, there's what's called a VAST measurement that tells us what that soil structure looks like. WEOC is the fuel that drives the engine. So that water extractable organic carbon, that's like the gas in your gas tank. If that number is low, you don't have enough gas. You've got to get that water extractable organic carbon higher. And again, it's part of that 96.6%. And so if we're not measuring that, how do we know how full our fuel tank is? Respiration is the RPMs. That tells us how fast that engine is going. It tells us what the throttle, where our throttle is at. And how do we adjust that throttle? I think that's one of the things that we're especially starting to focus more on is how do we change that respiration score? How do we get that cranking? That's what cover crops do, right? There's guys talking about making sure you have a living crop in your field as every day that you have a temperature above freezing. And so having a living root in your soil all the time, that's what that does. It gets that RPMs cranking. Buying biological products, whether that's a seed treatment or a bug in a jug, all of those things are going to impact that respiration score. So understanding how to measure that, and then what is that impact going to do to our crop? One of the key takeaways that we learned this year is that too much nitrogen is a bad thing. Okay, this is probably one of the take-home messages for every producer we work with, is that we have probably we have over-applied nitrogen in the past, and it has caused more harm than good. Too much nitrogen is a bad thing. The reason for that is if you over-apply nitrogen and don't have enough carbon to go with it, you burn your carbon up and you actually lower that WEOC score. It also blocks the flow of nutrients in the plant. There's a cation anion exchange that happens in the flow of nutrients going into that plant. And if we have too much nitrate, it blocks the other anions from being able to get into the plant. So understanding that we have to have a balance. We can't have this nitrate number too high, or we're gonna throw everything out of whack and out of balance. Too much nitrate causes the carbon or the bugs. So biology, one of the things that biology does in your soil is it makes the carbon, it creates the carbon. Okay, it's like adding additional carbon into your soil by getting that biology active. And so if we put on too much nitrogen, it overstimulates the biology, but then it dies. It doesn't have the correct balance to keep turning, and so it overstimulates it, and it to try to make that nitrogen plant available. So just know that too much nitrate is doing a lot of damage in our soil. That's kind of the key take home. Rule of thumb, no more than 60 pounds in a single application. Whether that's pre-plant, whether that's fall applied, we need to back these rates down, and I would probably even say that 40 is even a little safer. 40 to 60 pounds in any single application. That's a challenge. I don't think my brother Galen's in here, but last fall he was strip tilling and putting anhydrous on this field out here, and we'd had a discussion about it, and I said, we've got to back that rate down. The lowest I could get him to go was 120 or 140 pounds. Like, that's the way we've always done it. That's our system. We have to apply that nitrogen because it's the cheapest source. And so now our drip field out here has 140 pounds of nitrogen already applied. Because it was fall applied, that's probably not as bad, but if you're spring applying nitrogen especially, back those rates down. And I'm gonna show you a little bit more to kind of show you the impact of that and some of the measurements that we did this past year on our farm. This is that interaction I was looking for before, of nutrient to nutrient. So understand that nutrient balance there's an antagonism and a stimulation. In other words, if we look at, we all know that we need sulfur to go with nitrogen. So those are stimulation nutrients. They stimulate each other. But if you get that nitrate too high, it's going to block certain things. There's going to be an antagonism to potash. There's going to be an antagonism to copper. And especially this potash to the potash to nitrate one, that's one we've seen. And that when that nitrate is too high, it's blocking potassium from getting in the plant. So understand that there's a symbiotic relationship, and it's not all positive. So if we go throw too much nitrate in the system, we block other nutrients from getting in the plant. Balance is more important than values. So again, back to that nutrient balance index. This is a much more balanced tissue sample here. Our largest negative is iron at a -10. Our nutrient balance index is 100. So we've seen some of these numbers get closer in the 20 and 30 on some guys that are very balanced. But again, looking at the balance of these tissue samples versus individual values. One of the other notes that we've learned from this is that if you get sodium higher than potassium, the plant cannot distinguish between the two. So for anybody that, especially guys that have high sodium in their water, we need to be measuring what that sodium is doing in the soil. So you can see here we've got a sodium value of 415 part per million. The potassium is at 350, and this corn was dying. Like it's up in the Red River Valley. It was a new field that we just started working with, and the corn literally was shriveling up and dying. We were irrigating it, and it just kept going downhill. And so we pulled some soil samples, and sure enough, we've got sodium higher than potassium. And as that plant is taking that in, it's taking the sodium in instead of potassium, which is basically killing itself. Just like if you and I drank seawater, it would do the same thing to us. So those are things that we've learned and are learning with using the additional information that we can get on the next level ag samples. So that's primarily the lab that we'll be working with this year for soil and for tissue. Going to jump into some new technology that we started working with a year ago. I've got a sample of the sensor on the back table back there and some handouts for you if you're interested in learning more about this. But this is a technology from Europe. It's called the NutriSense sensor. And on the end of this little blade, there's an ion sensor that measures nitrate and potassium. Okay, so now instead of just measuring soil moisture content, now we have the option of being able to measure what is the potassium and nitrate values in our soil. And we learned some really interesting things this year. There was 3 of these sites in North America. We had one here. There was one in California on trees and another one in Washington on some fruit crops. But this is the only one on corn. And so the way this is installed, and this is up 2 miles north of here on our drip field, we put one sensor at 8 inches. So we're looking right at the root zone. And then we put another sensor at 30 inches. So we want to, or 24 inches because there was a hard clay layer, but ideally at 30. So basically what's underneath of our root zone, what are we leaching, and what's happening right in that root zone. In addition to that, and it's really hard to see in this picture, but there's some suction lysimeters. And I think I've got another picture that shows them a little better. But a suction lysimeter is a tube that goes down in the ground, and on the end of that, there's like a mesh sponge. And once a week, we would go put a vacuum on that PVC tube and shut that valve and let it sit there for a day. And the moisture in the soil would come into that tube. And then we'd go up with a syringe and a long tube and suck the water out of that. So essentially what we're doing is we're measuring what's the nutrient content of the water in the soil pore, and comparing that to the readings that we were getting off of this sensor. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this sensor is measuring the soil pore water, and it also picks up the nutrients that are attached to the soil colloid. So what we're getting in the water is only this soluble portion. What we're measuring with the sensor is a larger pool. So these two numbers don't always match. They don't match because we're measuring two different pools of nutrients. In addition to that, we would take corn leaves and run them through this garlic press, and we would measure the sap in the tissue at that exact same spot at that exact same time. And so now we have reference points of, we have the tool that's measuring at 8 inches, 24 inches. We have the lysimeter, which is the soil pore water at those same depths, and then we have the values of the sap. I have these little sensors on the back table if you want to take a look at them. This was the first year we had used them. The only ones that are available are potassium, nitrate, calcium, and sodium. So they're relatively inexpensive. I think they may be a tool that we use more extensively in the future as we learn how to interpret the values. I will tell you, I had mentioned this earlier, that if you go out and you take that sap early in the morning and then you have a hot sunny day and you go take it in the afternoon, those values could change 40%. There can be huge swings based on the time of day that you take that reading. So it's something that if you want to create a benchline or a benchmark, you have to do it at the same time of day and with the same conditions to really try to understand what's happening. Okay, so here's a few graphs and some things that we learned with this tool. This is early in the season, June 13th to August 8th. So this is kind of a full, growing season profile. This is the nitrate sensor at 24 inches. Now, this soil around here, for those of you that aren't local, we have heavy clay soil, CECs of 25 to 30. And our belief system has always been that we don't leach nitrate. That's just kind of, we think our soils are heavy enough that if we apply it, no matter how we apply it, we're gonna keep it in that growing, that root zone. Well, what we learned this year challenged that thinking, because look at what happened here to this 24-inch nitrate sensor right in here in June. We had some rain events. I don't have rain on this particular chart. I have it on a couple more. But you can see that nitrate value over the season at 24 inches was continually climbing. Okay? And that's nutrients that aren't available to the plant. Here's the potassium level at 24 inches. So you can see the potassium is dropping. And this is a little bit later in the season. We're July 29th to August 11th, so we're in that grain fill period. And you can see that potassium number was dropping, and it was dropping hard. We did some applications of in-season potassium, but we know that in our operation on these soils, potassium is one of our limiting factors. And so this wasn't really a surprise to us to see these potassium levels drop. What was a surprise is that at the same time that potassium was dropping, nitrate was increasing. Now go back to that nutrient balance and that nutrient interaction, and remember that too much nitrate blocks potassium. And potassium is always a number we struggle with. And look at what's happening in our soil here at 24 inches. Potassium's dropping, nitrate is increasing. And our belief system is that we don't leach nitrate. I'm starting to challenge that thinking, right? Like I'm starting to think that maybe we do leach nitrate. And here's a rain event in November. Again, after the growing season, after harvest has happened, look at what happens to this nitrate value on a rain event in November. This is all nitrate that we paid $1 a pound for last year, right? Those are dollars right there, just getting flushed out of my soil profile. Can't get them back. So I think when we take what we're learning here and we pair that with the idea that too much nitrate is throwing our soil out of balance, one of the things that we are going to reevaluate this year is our nitrogen management. We have to look at what we're doing with in-season nitrogen, because I think not only are we being inefficient, we're not getting it in the plant like we should be. This is that nutrient uptake chart. I got this off a presentation from the National No-Till Conference that kind of looks at it a little differently, but I think it kind of, I really like the message here. So this is a 400 bushel corn, weekly nutrients required to grow 400 bushel corn. And one of the things I want you to think about is on 400 bushel corn, to get to V6, we only need 10 pounds per week to get to V6. So between this V16, which would be right around tassel time or right before tassel, to the end is where we're at 230 to 400 pounds. Now, I showed the chart earlier where we spring apply or fall apply everything, and then is it available when we need it? We only need 10 pounds to get to V6, but yet this is when most of us are putting out over 50% of our nitrogen. In our operation on dry land, we're putting out 100% in this time period. And then we expect it to be available back here when we're trying to fill that kernel up. After tassel or at tassel time, we're at 64% of our nitrogen needs is where the uptake is at. Look at the sulfur numbers. So I thought this was real interesting. At tassel, we've only used 10% of sulfur. 10% is all we need to get to tassel on sulfur. The other 90% happens after tassel. On our operation, we're not doing much of anything to address that. And so when I look at those sulfur numbers for our growers, and they're 25 to 30% lower than they should be, and I look at this chart and I think we haven't addressed this uptake, especially as that rainfall, the sulfur in the rain has changed. So just challenging our thinking about how we're applying things. I want you to think about, look at your practices on your farm and what can we do to match these uptakes, I think is really important. And again, if we're going out and putting out 100 or 200 pounds of nitrogen, I think we're missing the boat when we do that all at one time. There's a whole nother piece to this nitrate issue that I want to bring up, especially for those of you from Nebraska, and I think it will be coming in other states. This is a presentation I sat in on up at, in Nebraska here a few weeks ago. Nitrate in groundwater is becoming a very big issue, especially in Nebraska. And so you can see these areas here that are red have a greater than 10 part per million. The gentleman that gave this presentation, he's a University of Nebraska employee, and maybe I would say he's neutral on ag. He's probably not super friendly to ag. I don't think he was anti-ag. But one of the things that he brought out, and I'll just kind of explain what they're measuring. So you have the aquifer, and between where the crops are being grown and the aquifer is called the vadose zone. In other words, that's the area that nutrients are at that are slowly moving towards the aquifer. Okay, and so they're going out and they're measuring what those nitrate levels are. And this next chart here shows what those values are on a pounds per acre. And you can see there's different depths to groundwater. No, I don't have that part on here, but the depth of groundwater can vary from 10 feet to 200 feet in Nebraska. So it can be a pretty big variation. But look at these pounds of nitrate that are stored in the vadose zone. 8,000 pounds per acre. The lowest in here is 70 pounds per acre. Most of them are in that 2,000 to 3,000 range. Pounds of nitrate that's sitting between where the crop is being grown and the groundwater. That's slowly moving towards the groundwater. Okay, this is a problem. And as I think about what we saw in a heavy clay soil where we didn't think we leach, and what we saw in that sensor, and then I think about Nebraska. Most of the places we work in Nebraska, I would consider a sandy loam. Some are very sandy, and we know that nitrogen moves a lot easier in sand. What would that sensor look like if it was placed in a Nebraska sandy soil or sandy loam? And so my goal is to have 50 of those sensors out in Nebraska this year to look at that and help farmers understand how much better could we do with nitrogen management. Because I think the conclusion of this gentleman's talk, he basically said there's a speed limit on the road that says how fast you can drive. And I think there should be a law that says how much nitrogen you can apply. And the folks in Europe that we work with that develop this technology, that's already happening in Europe. So to think that that's impossible to happen here, I think would be a little naive. So I think we can do better with nitrogen. I think there's an environmental component to this that's worth looking at. And certainly we have room for improvement. I think that's one of the take-home messages. Any questions or comments on that before I jump into some of the other work we're doing? Anybody online that has anything typed in, feel free to jump in with questions if you have them. And I'll be around. We can have a discussion about this later as well. But I think in general, I think we need to rethink nitrogen management. That's definitely one of the take-homes. Just kind of highlight here a little bit some of the other work that we're doing. We're doing a lot of work with effluent management with hog and dairy operations. So I'm going to kind of just highlight real quick a couple of the pieces of equipment and how that works. So basically what we're doing is we're taking deep pit or dairy manure that's being scraped out of a dairy. It goes through a solid separator, so it squeezes out the big particles that are in that manure. This is what that byproduct out of a screw press looks like. It has the texture and the consistency of corn silage, so you can stack it up and haul it and spread it. And then the second step to that is what we call this microfilter. So this is a device that inside of it has a drum that's spinning about 1,500 RPMs, and it throws the liquid through the screen. I think this video, there we go. That's not a chocolate fountain. That's actually manure. But that manure is clean enough to blend in with water to run through a drip irrigation system. So we're really excited about this work. To my knowledge, this is what I would say probably the first site where we can take a concentrated manure that has 10 to 12% solids, run it through two pieces of equipment, and get it clean enough to go through irrigation. So we have if you have interest in that, definitely let us know. Our goal this year is to have 2 or 3 of these units on a trailer where we'll be able to move them to different livestock operations. We can do about 50,000 gallons a day through this machine. So depending on the size of field or how many acres you have, we potentially could move this around to treat several different operations and get manure clean enough to go through drip irrigation. Yes. Okay, so the question is, what's the ratio and how thick are we blending this? So typically, it depends on how much moisture is in the soil and how fast we want to get it out, but we're usually doing about a 1:1 to a 1:5 parts. So if it's really wet, you don't need a lot of water. We could take 100 gallons a minute of irrigation water and 100 gallons a minute of manure, blend those together and send that out. That would probably be the most concentrated we would go. If we were irrigating, we would probably do more like a 1:5 or a 1:10 ratio. So, and how many gallons per acre you put out is going to be determined by the nutrient concentration. Hog manure, we're probably going to be putting out 2,000 to 5,000 gallon an acre. Dairy manure is going to be more in that 10,000 to 20,000 gallons an acre. So this unit itself is going to be around $50,000. The step before that's probably 30 to 40,000. So we're going to have by the time you get automation and things in there, we're thinking somewhere between $100 to $150,000 for that piece of equipment. The plan for this coming year is to have that on a trailer that we would rent out and charge somewhere around 1/10 of a cent a gallon. So most guys right now, if you're having manure applied with a drag line or a honey wagon, it's probably costing 1 to 3 cents a gallon. Where we're gonna have this equipment, we think, be somewhere around 1/10 of a cent per gallon. So how far can we travel with that? Yep. 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 Right. So the question is, how far can we go with it? So there's different, yeah, it would depend on the concentration of the manure and the cost of trucking. So we did a site in north central Iowa this past year where they had a lagoon that was pretty clean and pretty concentrated, and so we actually didn't need this equipment. It was clean enough already. What we did is we set up a frac tank, an oil frac tank at the drip field, and then they had a semi that just hauled back and forth, and he would fill up at the lagoon, haul it into the frac tank, and then we were pumping 30 to 100 gallon a minute out of that frac tank into the drip system during the growing season. So is it practical? I think it might be, because you can do it in season. I don't think we need a lot of it. I think in your situation particularly, I think it would be a supplement, that you could supplement your additional nutrients potentially that way if you have some manure to get rid of, in July and August. I think it's worth looking at. It really depends on how much water's in that manure. Is 2,000 gallon an acre going to be, well, how many pounds of nutrients are we going to get that way? I guess that's the question. And every site's going to be a little different. Chicken litter, to my knowledge, we don't have any way to liquefy it. Oh, top dress, for sure. During the season, no. I mean, preseason, yeah, we love chicken litter. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, we're using chicken litter here on our farm. It's a little bit challenging when I think about nutrient stratification on a no-till operation. Like, all that litter is sitting on top, and when it gets dry in the summer, those nutrients become unavailable. So how do you keep that available? I think is one of the challenges with litter on top of the ground. That's going to help keep it available if you can water over the top. Yep. So thinking about yeah, I think there's a potential there for sure. So pretty excited about the progress we've made in the last year on manure. We have a lot of interest from producers to utilize this technology. We're primarily working with a dairy in west central Minnesota and South Dakota. Todd Roki is here with us today. That'd be Travis's dad. He has been doing manure through drip for 4 years, and applying around we've put 2.1 million gallons of effluent on over the past 4 years. So Todd, in his situation, I don't have a picture of it, but he has an outdoor lagoon. And so that outdoor lagoon, we don't need all that equipment. Basically, the solids settle out and we can just pump the liquid off the top. One of the challenges we've had there is that lagoon is too dirty early in the season to get it to just go straight through our drip system. So this year we're hoping to have a new pumping setup in place that we can start pumping that manure earlier. In the past, we've only been doing that late July, early August, and I think there's some potential for doing that earlier. So pretty good ROIs on those. This is the dairy we're working with up in Minnesota. They have a product called Feed Pad Runoff that has a lot of water in it. We've put on 168 million gallons of that. They used to apply it with a drag line. So to apply that 168 million gallons would have cost them 1.7 million. And that's about what they've spent on 7 drip systems to get that manure applied. So again, just the cost of application savings sometimes will pay for those drip systems in and of themselves. We're continuing to do more work with drainage. So I think this video is here. So one of the things that we learned several years ago, we had installed a drip field. It had rained quite a bit. We came through and started trenching through the end of the field to put our pipe in, and water started dripping out of that drip line. We're like, where did that come from? How did water get inside there? And so we've continued to do work on this to try to figure out how to utilize the drip system to remove excess water during the growing season. We have several fields we're working with now in Missouri and Illinois where we installed it with that purpose. So this year we're hoping to get some good data to really quantify how much water can we remove from a field and what is the benefit to that. But I think there's some potential for that, and we're excited to learn more about that. One of the ways that we're doing it is by blowing air into the system. So we're using that same blower that we use to winterize a system to come in and push all the water out and flush it out on the flush end of the field. I think that's all I had. So if you have questions, be glad to take those if you had anything else come to mind. So the question was, did we do a CO2 score before and after cover crop? So we have not on our farm, but there is some data out there around that, for sure. Yep. For those of you that are here, Clint Summerholder, I think I can introduce Clint. So Clint is working with some biological companies. Clint, you want to raise your hand? I think that's, so yeah, if you have questions on biologicals, Clint would be a good resource to check into. John is also working with some here in the orange shirt. Forgot about, yep, sorry, didn't mean to forget you, John. Yep. David Pudick here is with APSA 80. So David's product changes soil structure. So when we talk about soil structure, the way that water moves in the soil, it's something that we're testing. We have some data that we're starting to collect on his product. So if you have, especially if you have tight soil or water, places that water doesn't move in the soil real well, I think David's product is worth looking at, and he has some demonstrations set up there in the back. So that's something else we're going to be looking at this year a little more. Okay, Ryan. How much sulfur are we putting on ahead of time in the drip tape ground? So I would go back and look at that nutrient uptake chart, and I don't think there needs to be a lot in front. I think there needs to be a lot of sulfur done in the season, whether that's AMS that's diluted down in water. We're going to be doing some more work this year with sulfur burners, which Cortland will talk about. More work with sulfuric acid, where we can melt down. Basically, it's a product that has sulfuric acid melted with urea. So instead of buying 28 or 32%, buying urea and sulfuric acid, and it's a blend of those two products. You can get it pre-blended, or it's something you could actually do on your farm with a little bit of setup. So I think there's some other ways that we need to look at introducing sulfur into the system at a lower price point. That's one of the things that, and Cortland's got some charts on that as far as cost and what's the most cost-effective way to apply sulfur. So yeah, tissue sampling, I think if you don't have past data to give you kind of a benchmark of where you've been, I feel like every week to 10 days is kind of a good rhythm to get in to get that bench line data collected. Once, I would say year 3, 4, and 5, once you get data and you start to see where you're falling at, you can probably back that off to every other week, or even down to 5 times a year, I think might be sufficient, just to kind of give you a check and balance to understand what's happening. But to start with, we feel like once a week is really, really important to get that data collected. Stock nitrate test, we have done some of that testing in the past. Recently we haven't been putting a lot of energy in that. We're more looking at what's happening during the season. But I think it's an interesting measurement to see what's left over at the end of the year. Yep. Jim. So are we talking about changing the 6-to-1 ratio? Yes, especially late in the season. I think we maybe need to be closer to a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1. But I think the other thing that's important is that we get enough total nitrogen out there. So for example, if your total nitrogen program was 200 pounds and we were targeting a 6-to-1 ratio, we would have only applied, what would that be, 20, 30 pounds of nitrogen, and we need, or excuse me, of sulfur, and we need to be closer to that 70 to 80 pounds of total sulfur. So sulfur, right, the availability is, yeah, the availability is an issue. One of the things that we're looking at setting up this year is a device that will, or a machine that will solubilize AMS. So be able to go to the elevators and dry AMS and solubilize that and inject that through a drip system. That's fairly easy to do. We did it last year on kind of a small scale, but I think that's a really simple method to getting sulfur locally. Yes. AMS is ammonium sulfate. So it's and it comes as a dry. There's a spray version and a spreadable version, but either one of those would work. Yep. Okay, so I had mentioned NutriSense earlier. So NutriSense in the past 3 months has been, I want to say, I don't know how to explain it exactly, but kind of merged with a company called Ravatech. They're based in South Africa, is where their headquarters are, or it's where their main operations are. But this is the company that is now handling the NutriSense system. So go to their website. It's just rava.ag. There's a little bit you can learn on there, but we're going to be working with these guys. So if you want to know more about the NutriSense sensor and potentially getting one of those, price point for that is there's kind of a couple different levels. And don't hold me to these values, but roughly somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. Kind of the low level would be a $5,000 system. A little bit more advanced would be $10,000. You get more services basically, where they will consult with you more frequently on that higher dollar one. So that's something we're looking at. I think, like I said, especially in Nebraska, for those of you that are in the crosshairs of nitrogen management, I think it's something we need to look at. Okay, any other questions? We'll take a quick 5-minute break here while Cortland sets up and get his demonstration set up. So thank you.